So we're going to finish off now with a really important book launch. And I'm just going to introduce Ella and some of the things that she's going to talk about. So again, I must thank everyone, because I realise some people have just arrived, which is much appreciated. In particular, I should thank our extra special guest, which is Mr. and Mrs. Houston, and Ella's mum and dad. And the Cyprian Ella husband. I'm sure all three of you are very proud of Ella today, as are we. I'll just expand on that a little bit. I'm in a good position. I don't need to sort of read up on talking about Ella. I haven't checked on any facts or anything like that. I know it inside out, so I can chat to you about Ella as long as you like. But she's given me 5 minutes. So I'll just say very quickly then, lots of the things that we talk about when we talk about the CCDS, Ella will be involved at every level. So one of the things that we sometimes talk about when we talk about the CCDS is the Disability Studies MA, and I've met lots of people today who've already done the MA, lots of people who are just about finished with the MA, and Ella was actually the first student, one of 2 students who started the MA 12 years ago, is it now?
Gosh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because we've just finished in the 11th year, so anyway, yeah. So we would never have really got started if we hadn't been for 2 students who took up the course, and Ella was one of those 2. And so that's the sort of involvement. And of course now Ella teaches as a senior lecturer on the Disability Studies MA, so that many of the students here who are doing that course know Ella in that capacity, which is a story I've told many times, and you couldn't quite to tell that story. Another thing that we talk about when we talk about the CCDS is the Journal of Literary and Cultural Disability Studies. And like 1 or 2 people, Ella actually started her publication history by publishing a comment in JLCDS. So as a student, she was, was able to come in class with the journal under her arm that she was in, which was kind of nice. Again, it's nice for me to be in a position to witness these things. And it's fair to say that in that capacity of her connection with the Journal of Literary and Cultural Disability Studies, she is now the book reviews editor, which she's been doing for more than a year or so, and she's outstanding in this role. Likewise, she has done a special issue, and again, if I were to touch base on that special issue, she talked to me about wanting to do something on the representation, the disability in advertising and so on. I had the conversation I've had with many of you here, and I said, yeah, this is a good idea, an excellent idea. It's best that you team up with someone. It's better for you, it's better for the work, it's better for the readers. And we had a conversation about who that might be, who she might team up with. And the very first choice was the choice that we went with, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I think Ella wondered whether she'd be interested. And indeed, do you want to say who that was?
Professor Beth Haller.
Yeah, so Beth Haller and Ella Houston did that special issue, which was, again, a real nice thing for the journal and a real nice thing for Ella. I said that there were other things that we kind of would link Ella to. At the beginning, I talked about a dear colleague who's no longer with us, in disability studies more broadly. And again, when I had a conversation with Ella when she was an MA student about, she was interested in doing a PhD, and she had particular interest and so on. And we had a conversation about who she might go and be supervised by. And right at the very top of that list was a certain person. I'm proud to say I recommended her, and I think you read around to check it was okay what I was suggesting. Right? And I know that Ella had a brilliant experience with Professor Carol Thomas, as many of you here will have done. So again, that's why I wanted to come back to that particular name. And I have mentored Ella. I think I'm strictly mentoring her now, strictly speaking I should say, but I've got to say I ask surely more of her than she ever asks of me now. So you can see how much this colleague has progressed. You know, in that spirit, I just want to be more specific now about a particular book series that I started a few years ago called Autocritical Disability Studies. And this book series has now, I think we have 8 books that have been contracted. And 5 of those are already in publication. 2 of them are edited collections, so I won't open those up because there's a lot of people here in the room who have contributed to those, and I would hate to miss one. Then we have some monographs in that series. Perhaps most obviously the Midgetism by Dr Erin Pritchard, who I know is here. Another one by myself, and we'll just call that Disability Duplicity short. And then the next one, which is by Ella Houston, who is the colleague I want to focus on now. So this is a distant relative, I think, of your PhD, fair to say, but she is someone who's done that in the true spirit of doing the PhD as a PhD, doing all the things that requires, and then taking that contribution to the knowledge and building on that to write a book from afresh, but I say drawing on that work. And I know because she sent me every single chapter, we had a conversation about every single chapter, so it's been a great joy for me to be reading her work so closely. This is obviously the book that we're going to have Ella talking about now, and we're lucky to have a guest to do a respondent, but I'll let Ella do the rest of the talking. But can I just ask you to show your appreciation to Dr. Ella Houston.
Hi everybody, is my microphone working okay? Can everyone hear me at the back? Good. Thank you so much, David. So as I've said before, I'm genuinely touched that people took time out of their days, and we've got people who've travelled from various parts of the UK to be here. And those of you who are on campus anyway, still, I know that you've got a lot to be doing at the moment. So the fact that you're here is much appreciated. As David mentioned, my mum and dad have joined, which is so nice to have them in the room as well. And my husband, Cyprian Rousseau. For anyone who I've taught, you probably feel like you know Cyprian personally as a friend, because every class I teach, I manage to get at least one anecdote about him. So here he is in the flesh, everybody. And of course, a genuine, heartfelt thanks to Professor David Bolt. As David mentioned, I was in the first instance a student at Hope. I started my degree here in disability studies in 2010. And David, in the acknowledgement section of my book, I mentioned that the book would not exist without David. And I'm not simply saying that just to be nice or because it sounds nice. It's genuinely the case. Since I was a student, David has really always taken the time to talk to me, to care about my work. I dread to think how many hours I've taken of your time, David, running ideas past you, you reading through my work and really helping me to develop as a writer, really developing my passion for writing and to take some risks and be more creative with writing. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you. Okay, so to start at the very beginning, I'd like to show you a picture, which I've included on the slide, and this was taken in July 2013, on the day I graduated from my Disability Studies undergraduate degree at Liverpool Hope University. The picture shows me and a few of my course mates standing next to Professor Bolt, Dr Owen Barden and Dr Laura Waite. Now, the picture does look like it's been cut off. I promise you it hasn't, so please, if anyone's thinking I was on the other side, it's just the picture, how the picture was taken. I've not cropped it. This day was bittersweet. I was proud and so relieved that I'd made it to the finish line, but it signalled the end of a degree that really did change my life. I was 17 years old when I first visited Hope on an open day, feeling very unsure at the prospect of university after hating every second that I spent at school. I thought that doing a degree in disability studies would enable me to help disabled people. Sorry, disclaimer, I don't think that anymore. I had a vague notion that eventually I'd like to be a speech and language therapist, maybe. My lecturers, who I am now able to refer to as my colleagues, changed all of this. The course, which is aligned with the Centre for Culture and Disability Studies, taught me that disabled people piss on pity. Disabled people don't have special needs, they have human rights, and the course led me to embrace disability culture and community. I came to identify as disabled as the course enabled me to develop deeper understandings of my own identity and life experiences. A couple of months after I completed my undergraduate degree, I started the Disability Studies MA, which is led by Prof Bolt. Here is a picture of me standing in between Professor Claire Penketh, who is subject lead for Disability Studies and my manager, and my course mate, Dr Stephen Newport. Of all the things I learnt from Prof Bolt during the MA, his ability to hone in on seemingly small aspects of representations and consider what they reveal about social attitudes towards disability and the ramifications that they have for disabled people in everyday life really captured my attention. Following a class, Prof Bolt delivered on disability in advertising, and our subsequent conversation regarding this topic, my curiosity in the ideas that would later lay the foundations for my book was sparked. I completed my PhD at Lancaster University, and as David has mentioned, I was supervised by the late Professor Carol Thomas and Dr Lisa Ashmore. Prof Thomas's concept of psycho-emotional disablism, which recognises how disabled people are psychologically and emotionally impacted when they face discrimination, led me to interview disabled women as part of my doctoral research. On this slide, there is an image of Prof Thomas's book, Female Forms, within which she introduces the concept of psycho-emotional disablism. During interviews I conducted during my doctoral research, participants reflected on how representations of disability and gender in advertising impacted their sense of self, so their own identity, their self-esteem, and how they believe advertisements influence how other people treat them. While advertising disability represents a different research project, taking a far more expansive approach, I draw on some excerpts from the interviews I conducted with disabled women. As part of the Autocritical Disability Studies book series, the book considers disabled people's and disabled activists' responses to advertisements, recognising their reflections on and resistance to cultural attitudes towards disability. So before I discuss a selection of themes from across each chapter, across the main body of the book, so don't worry, I'm not going to exhaustively talk you through each chapter. I think that could be a bit tiresome. I'll just pick up on a couple of themes from each chapter. I'm going to highlight the key features of the book overall to provide some context for you. So first of all, the book takes an interdisciplinary approach. What this means is that I draw on different subjects and disciplines when I analyse advertisements, in particular cultural disability studies, media studies and advertising studies. Analyses of advertisements are informed by empirical and textual data. So in other words, as well as analysing text, i.e. advertisements, I gather data from people, so my interviews with disabled women. And I seek to expand key debates in cultural disability studies. So, for example, the tendency of popular culture to promote sweeping and stereotypical meta-narratives of disability at the expense of embodied counter-narratives, alongside cultural disability studies' resistance to neoliberal inclusionism. So I will go on to explain what these terms refer to in greater detail. By analysing advertisements from the 18th century onwards, the book tracks how the advertising industry's fixation with the ableist beauty myth across history has actually, in more recent years, evolved into more diverse portrayals of disability. Another feature, advertising's unrivaled ability to reinforce, but also to challenge socio-cultural ideologies surrounding disability on a vast scale, is something that I speak about or think about in depth across the book. Okay, so first of all, let's think about from misfortune to mainstream. The first chapter considers how dynamic and forward-thinking representations of disabled people have gradually replaced pity appeals in advertising. So I've written in my script on my left, and I'm having to think about my right and my left now. On one side of the screen, there is a black and white advertisement from the 1970s, and this advertisement was produced for the Muscular Dystrophy Society. So this advert really epitomises charity advertising. There is an image of a boy sitting in a wheelchair in a deserted field with a town in the distant background. The tagline, "He'd love to walk away from this poster too," gives the harmful impression and the problematic and misleading impression that disabled people are, in quotes, trapped in their bodies. The advertisement on my other side was released in 2020 for the UK fashion brand George at Asda. This advert depicts a young, attractive woman who has chronic fatigue syndrome striking an artistic pose while sitting on her wheelchair. The contrast between these images reflects how, despite its long history of either ostracising disabled people or depicting disabled people as objects of pity, contemporary advertising actually pushes boundaries, inviting people to think differently about disability. However, as I hope to make clear in this presentation, although the advertising industry has in many ways transformed its attitudes towards disability, in many instances there remains only the illusion of progress. The book focuses on advertising from the 18th century onwards, as I've mentioned, and as Stuart Ewan explains, advertising during this period emerged as a direct response to mass industrial capitalism. So the Industrial Revolution, which involved the global expansion of industrialisation across the 18th and 19th centuries, played a really big role in shaping societal perceptions of disabled people. So this was a period of time when attitudes towards disability changed for the worse. And they changed, perceptions started to be of disabled people as pitiable rather than productive, as the Industrial Revolution created really big demands for workers who could perform fast-paced and gruelling physical labour. Advertisements in this period moved from being factual notices to incorporating psychological and emotional appeals, and they capitalised from many people's fears of not fitting into rapidly developing urban environments. Advertisers promoted ableism by completely segregating people with impairments from images of beauty, desire and success. Now, moving forward to the 1950s, advertisements actually started to target new and diverse consumer audiences. Racial stereotypes started to decrease in advertising following the onset of the civil rights movement in 1954. Although depictions of women as housewives and pretty objects also started to decrease, advertisements increasingly featured feminist rhetoric. So advertisements appeared to be changing their ways and their approaches towards women, but often there would simply be very tokenistic references to the women's rights movement. However, it took until the 1980s for images of disabled people enjoying their lives with friends and family and as members of the workplace to appear in advertisements. Research by Haller and Ralph documents how bold and daring portrayals of disability began to chip away at pitying and patronising attitudes. By the 1990s, global brands such as McDonald's and Levi Strauss were including deaf actors and people with impairments in their advertisements. So towards the end of this chapter, so the first main body chapter, I consider the problem of tokenism in 21st century advertising. Although representations of disability in advertising are now actually becoming quite commonplace, so next time you turn on your TV or go on social media, I think that you are quite likely to see a portrayal of a disabled person in an advert. So even though they're becoming more commonplace, performative, so quite superficial gestures towards inclusion are rife. For instance, while plenty of advertisements feature models with physical and sensory impairments, portrayals of people with dwarfism, cognitive impairments such as learning disabilities and mental health issues remain scarce. Also, as research by David Bolt points out, the vast majority of advertisements are inaccessible for disabled audiences, failing to use closed captions and verbal descriptions of visual content. Drawing on David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder's concept of neoliberal inclusionism, I critique the growing trend of so-called pro-diversity advertisements. As Leonard Davis argues, in seemingly pro-diversity advertisements, so advertisements that look like they celebrate diversity in all of their forms, they often actually take a cherry-picking approach. White, cisgender, heterosexual models whose impairments or accessibility aids are barely visible or treated as novelties are disproportionately represented. So the concept of neoliberal inclusionism exposes how disabled people are included in superficial, quite meaningless ways in profit rather than people-driven societies. Representations of diversity take a tick box approach. So this means that brands and institutions look good and gain kudos for appearing to promote inclusion despite doing next to nothing in regards to driving societal change. Okay, so building on key contextual information provided in Chapter 1, the second chapter, Moneymaker, Piss Taker, Charities Advertising and Non-Disabled Saviours. So I am critiquing this idea of non-disabled saviours. Please don't think I'm endorsing the idea that non-disabled people save disabled people. They certainly don't. This chapter explores the enduring legacy of disability charity advertising. Although tear-inducing charity advertisements are widely praised by the media and general public, they undermine the disabled people movement's demands for rights, not charity. Portrayals of disability in charity adverts epitomise neoliberal inclusionism because they imply that disabled people are empowered by small change rather than radical challenges to societal inequalities. High-profile charity advertisements typically misrepresent barriers facing disabled people. For example, the UK-based charity Scope, their End the Awkward advertising campaign from 2014, received so much praise for its supposedly awareness-raising credentials, and I've included images from this advertising campaign on the slide. One shows a non-disabled woman with an uneasy expression on her face next to the message, "How do I shake a hand that isn't there?" While the other shows a man, a non-disabled man, bending down next to the message, "I've bent down to a wheelchair user, now what?" However, This advertising campaign, even though it appears to, spark a conversation, it fails to address major issues that disabled people's organisations have been fighting against for decades. In retaliation, disabled activists called on Scope to end the bullshit, never mind end the awkward. In the words of one activist, with disability hate crime on the increase, the closure of the Independent Living Fund, the bedroom tax, the assisted dying bill, the cumulative effects of cuts on disabled people, the vilification of disabled people in the right-wing press, why is Scope still banging on about end the awkward? Okay, so for years, disabled people's self-advocacy groups have campaigned against major charities that reinforce harmful attitudes towards disability, despite claiming to have disabled people's best interests at heart. For instance, thanks to campaigns led by prominent self-advocacy groups such as People First, MenCap abandoned their Little Stephen icon in the 1990s, and I've included this icon on the slide. The cartoon depiction of a helpless boy, which promotes the meta-narrative of people with learning disabilities as vulnerable and not fully human, to use Owen Barden and Stephen Walden's words, was actually replaced following the campaign with an image of people with learning disabilities enjoying life. Many charities are moving away from advertising campaigns, which are increasingly criticised by audiences as emotionally manipulative. Research by Lee and Atkinson reveals that people who donate to charities like to see the positive results of their generosity, and they particularly like, which is a bit worrying, portrayals of happy victims who, despite tragic circumstances, can look forward to brighter futures thanks to charitable interventions. Hopefully a sarcastic tone in my voice is coming through because I'm sceptical of these suggestions. Analysing a television advertisement for Sense, which is a charity for disabled people who have complex support requirements, I suggest that although charities are moving towards advertisements that focus on seemingly positive stories, emphasising what disabled people can do, they typically do so by bolstering the position of non-disabled saviours, in quotes. As David Bolt explains in the preface to his edited collection on meta-narratives of disability, which also features in the Autocritical Disability Studies book series, assumed authority, to use David's term, is a central aspect of the meta-narrative of disability. Non-disabled people fail to recognise the harm they cause when they assume that they are acting in the best interests of disabled people in ways that make themselves look woke, helpful and generous, despite undermining the agency and independence of disabled people. Sense's TV advertisement, released in 2020 during the COVID pandemic, is framed as a coronavirus emergency appeal, emphasising that donations are vital as support for disabled children has been snatched away, to use their term. The advertisement appeals to non-disabled audiences' sense of altruism, so their desire to be kind and help poor disabled kids, stressing that disabled children urgently require help. So here's an excerpt from the voiceover in the TV advertisement. Many of the children are deaf-blind and rely on our support. The simple things that make them feel secure, that help them feel connected with the world around them, have been snatched away. There are hundreds of vulnerable children across the country whose lives have been turned upside down. It's vital that we continue to reach them and make sure they feel safe. That's why I'm asking you to get your phone out now to help us be there for a child like Elliot. Elliot was born deaf-blind. Can you imagine how scary and confusing it is for a child like him right now? Dramatic expressions such as snatched away, hundreds of vulnerable children and lives have been turned upside down suggest that deaf-blind children would be destitute without the charity's support. Rather than getting a sense of the children as real people, a sense of distance is created between them and the non-disabled audience, as though they are simply characters in a sad story. Despite the message that hundreds of vulnerable children depend on the charity, the audience is asked to donate to help us be there for a child like Elliot. And this is a technique that avoids the audience feeling overwhelmed by the thought of the many children they are unable to help. The bleak situation facing these children is contrasted with scenes of Elliot having fun and playing. So, you know, as is typical in charity advertisements now, they actually focus on the positives, like, look at the life that Elliot is now leading. However, while the advertisement appears to offer a happy ending, showing a positive outcome for Elliot, the implicit message, the harmful message, is that none of this would exist without charitable interventions and non-disabled so-called saviours. Developing understandings of clashes between meta-narratives and counter-narratives of disability, Chapter 3, which is titled Masking Madness, Pathologising Portrayals of Mental Health in Advertising, explores representations of mental health issues in direct-to-consumer pharmaceutical advertising, as well as anti-stigma advertising campaigns created by charities and public health organisations. So in particular, in this chapter, I argue that the prevalence of the meta-narrative of mental illness in advertising undermines activist counter-narratives of madness that are led by people's experiences of mental and emotional diversity. The role of pharmaceutical corporations in promoting dramatised and distorted messages about mental health is vast. However, in comparison to charity advertising, advertisements produced by the pharmaceutical industry, and by the way, according to DeVille and Lamaya, the pharmaceutical industry spends twice as much on advertising as it does on research and development. They're all done in London. London, America, across the world, to be honest with you. They've actually received, in comparison to charity adverts though, far less attention in cultural disability studies. Charity and pharmaceutical advertisements are similar insofar as they claim that they act in the best interests of people with impairments and mental health issues, despite reinforcing stereotypes on a mass scale. However, whereas charity advertising persuades non-disabled audiences to pity and act on behalf of disabled people, pharmaceutical advertisements target people who experience mental health issues directly, emphasising the importance of self-help. On the surface, direct-to-consumer pharmaceutical advertising, and you might wonder what I'm talking about here, it's because direct-to-consumer pharmaceutical adverts, so adverts that promote via television, social media, prescription-only drugs, so antidepressants and so on, it's actually only legal practice in New Zealand and America. Although watch this space, you know, the way that NHS is going, maybe they'll be promoted here soon as well. So these advertisements appear to have empowering intentions because they frame medication as a quick and effective solution for people who want to recover control of their lives. However, despite the positive veneer of these advertisements, they reinforce how neoliberal society makes people feel as though they always have to work on self-improvement. In order to sell so-called wonder drugs, pharmaceutical advertisements strive to convince people that their thought processes, outlooks on life, and approaches to emotional regulation are inherently flawed. They exploit insecurities, such as fears of being stigmatised and judged, that are often experienced by people who live with mental health issues, with the framing of prescription drugs as self-help strategies playing on feelings of self-doubt that people with mental health issues often experience when they are presumed by other people to not help themselves. Drawing on interviews I conducted with disabled women, I found that even in instances where individuals are highly sceptical of pharmaceutical companies, they can find themselves being taken in by enticing appeals. For instance, Chris, and by the way, I'm not using the real names of any participants, pseudonyms are used. So Chris has lived with anxiety and depression for many years, and she was openly sceptical about the pharmaceutical industry. During our interview, I showed Chris an advertisement for the antidepressant Wellbutrin XL. The advertisement, which is shown on this slide, depicts an attractive blonde woman who is shown smiling in front of a tranquil beach background alongside the tagline, "I'm ready to experience life." In response to the advertisement, Chris remarked, "I've been looking for something, a miracle drug myself, looking for something and thinking, wow, this is going to be it, and it's not. Well, if it's a US firm, before I've even looked any deeper, I can tell you it's going to be positive. Positive as in they can sell you bin bags and you think your life's going to change. Straight away, I'd want to be getting the name of that and buying it. I'm thinking, here's a way out. I might not have to have the red wine now. I'm actually looking for a number on it now. I'm cynical because it's another trap into spending money and making multinational companies into millionaires on the promise that they're going to get rid of your depression, which I don't actually think they would. That's not empowering, is it? When they're trying to make money out of you, out of your insecurities, your depression, and things like that. Although Chris suggests that pharmaceutical companies make huge profits on the promise they're going to get rid of your depression, she is also seemingly tempted by the apparent simple answer presented in the advertisement. In a similar way to many people who receive a lack of support when experiencing mental health issues, even though she distrusts profit-driven pharmaceutical companies who pick up on your vulnerabilities, she cannot help but wish that they have found a miracle drug to solve the issues she faces. As Brylla et al. Suggest, that these advertisements feature romanticised portrayals and emotion-stirring strategies as a shortcut by which feelings aid decisions. The advertisement's positive framing approach, "I'm ready to experience life," is designed to stand out to people living with depression who are typically bombarded with bleak and fear-provoking representations of mental health issues in the mass media. In particular, it targets individuals who have internalised the meta-narrative of mental illness, believing that they will have a dulled existence if they do not accept pharmaceutical interventions. Crossing the tagline, advertisers' controversial, humorous and risky approaches to disability. By the way, I apologise for the whistle-stop tour, and please let me assure you that the discussion and analysis is not this brief in the book. I think David would have been worried otherwise. Okay, so from chapter 4 onwards, so from this chapter onwards, I consider more recent developments in relation to disability and advertising. This chapter argues that controversial representations of disabled people can actually encourage non-disabled audiences to question their taken-for-granted assumptions about disability. Existing cultural disability studies analyses of advertising often call for more realistic and mundane depictions of disabled people. However, some disabled people incorporate risky counter-narratives into their everyday life and identities. For example, for some disabled people, it's empowering to use dark humour and to embrace taboo topics in order to make their mark on society. Advertisements that reflect risky counter-narratives help to challenge aspects of neoliberal inclusionism. Instead of taking a tick-box, superficial approach to representing disability, they encourage deeper and more complex forms of audience engagement. However, this chapter also considers how controversial advertisements such as those featuring edgy jokes, sexual innuendo, references to stereotypes and confrontational messages, can recycle rather than challenge ableist attitudes. For instance, at times, comical approaches trivialise barriers faced by disabled people. They can also reinforce expectations for disabled people to make jokes at their own expense, so that non-disabled people feel less awkward about disability. This chapter's critical engagement with disability and humour also indicates that involving disabled people in the production of advertisements is not a catch-all solution for producing better representations of disability. So in other words, of course, I think that it's really important for the advertising industry to up its game in involving disabled people in the production of advertisements. However, it worries me that sometimes this is the automatic response. Oh, include disabled people and like all is well and good. Actually, it's a bit more complex than that. So to illustrate this issue, I analyse a television advertisement produced for the Irish gambling company Paddy Power in 2010. The advertisement shows Tiddles the cat running into the middle of the so-called Blind Wanderers FC football game. After a moment of suspense, there is a close-up upper body shot of a blind footballer taking a kick. And I've included a screenshot of this moment on the slide. And it's immediately followed by the sound of a screeching cat. So not that I need to be patronising and explain the joke, but the idea is the footballer didn't know the cat was on the field and has launched the cat into the air. As the footballers come to a standstill, a couple of people are smiling here, but I'm trying to problematise this. As the footballers come to a standstill, looking puzzled, a Paddy Power representative walks onto the pitch, explaining that while we cannot get Tiddles back, they offer money-back specials for betting. The advertisement exploits the ableist trope, as Stephen Cusistu puts it, of comic blind characters who are supposedly blissfully unaware of misadventures and near misses. However, the advertisement was actually defended by Great Britain Blind Football for involving genuine blind footballers who have a sense of humour. In this instance, I would argue, it seems as though having personal experience of blindness was not enough to stop the footballers or Great Britain Blind Football from condoning ableist humour. Alongside ableist humour, it is also problematic when, to use Julie Allen's term, non-disabled audiences act as the gatekeepers of inclusion, taking offence to risky portrayals of disability on behalf of disabled people. For instance, a television advertisement released in 2016 for Malteser's Chocolate, featuring actor Stoom Toulis, who has cerebral palsy, making her friends laugh and gasp as she recounts a recent sexual encounter, and praise from many disabled people, yet actually provoked outrage from non-disabled audiences. On the slide, I've included a screenshot from the advertisement alongside its tagline, "Look on the light side." So in this advert, Toulis mentions that her hand spasmed when she was being intimate with her boyfriend, and she remarks, well, he wasn't complaining, while shaking a bag of Maltesers until they burst out of the packet. Now, I know I explained the previous joke, but I won't go there this time. Although many disabled people appreciated the advertisement's relatable approach to sex and disability, this advert was actually one of the top 10 most complained about advertisements across 2016 and 2017, with complaints describing it as overly sexual and offensive to disabled people. Instead of encouraging the audience to admire or be amazed by Toulis, which would create the impression that disabled people who are sexually active are exceptions to the rule, I would argue that Malteser's advertisement depicts disability and sexuality as part of a slice of life representation. However, I should also note that the advertisement has been criticised by relying on a sense of incongruity, as the notion that a spasm helped rather than hindered Toulis's sexual encounter implies that, in Alison Wilde's words, a disabled person is stepping out of role. So Alison Wilde suggests that part of the reason why people might find it funny or shocking is because a disabled woman is talking about something that we wouldn't expect her to. As my colleague Erin Pritchard notes, at its worst, incongruous humour provides non-disabled audiences with a feeling of superiority as they laugh as a form of defence when disabled people challenge their perceptions of normality. Developing my exploration of risky approaches to disability in advertising, Chapter 5, From Disavowed to Desirable, Sexy, Sanitised and Speculative Advertising, suggests that the portrayals of disabled people as attractive, self-confident and sexy signal a major change from the use of disability as, to use Tom Shakespeare's words, a dustbin for disavowal. Advertisements that feature attractive and desirable disabled models promote counter-narratives. And I should clarify, I've used this term counter-narratives a couple of times. So a counter-narrative is a narrative, a story, an idea that disabled people promote to fight back at the ableist status quo. So counter-narratives are empowering. So I find that in this chapter I discuss how these advertisements promote counter-narratives that rethink fixed conceptions of beauty and sexuality. However, this chapter finds that, in some ways, representations of self-assured and sexually empowered disabled people provide misleading signs of societal progress, given that opportunities for disabled people to develop a strong sense of self-esteem are constantly undermined by ableist attitudes and barriers in society. Inclusionism is rife in fashion advertising, given its tendency to feature disabled models in one-off advertising campaigns, primarily designed to make brands look good. Analysing a print advertisement produced as part of Kenneth Cole's renowned advertising campaign, We All Walk in Different Shoes, and this campaign started in 2008, I draw attention to its superficial approach to diversity and inclusion. The advertisement, which I've included on the slide, features former Paralympic athlete and model Amy Mullins promoting the brand's 25-year history of non-uniform thinking. Mullins stares down towards the camera lens, standing in a power position with both hands on her hips. The tagline, We All Walk in Different Shoes, is positioned next to Mullins, whose attractiveness is emphasised by her sleek hairstyle, glamorous makeup, a tight-fitting black skirt, a bright red top and stiletto heels. Despite the claim that the campaign fights against the normative status quo, Mullins actually appears to pass as non-disabled. Her prosthetic legs match the colour of her skin, with the top of one prosthetic leg partially hidden by her skirt. Drawing on Rebecca Feasy's phrasing, the advertisement conforms to and confounds challenges the ableist beauty myth. However, some of the disabled women I interviewed argued that audiences are more likely to focus on Mullins as a person because her prosthetic legs are barely noticeable. Although, as Mary Jane, who has physical impairments and uses a wheelchair, points out, this approach naively assumes that disabled people are able to choose whether or not they're treated different by other people. In her words, I couldn't tell that Mullins is using prosthetic legs. I think this advert is a double-edged sword. This is very mainstream to me. This is a very powerful woman, a beautiful woman, and why shouldn't disabled women be beautiful and powerful? It's not just that she has prosthetic legs, it's how she is using them. She's got one of them coming out at this angle and the other one is very straight. It's quite sexy, it's quite dominant, you know. I mean, it's nice to feel accepted and for your differences to rarely be seen as apparent by others, but unfortunately that rarely happens. Fashion advertisements that apply, to use Mitchell and Snyder's term, a neoliberal gloss to representations of disability, assimilating bodily impairments into the ableist beauty myth, reinforce feelings of inadequacy and alienation for disabled people who can't easily disguise their impairments. As Joanna, who has mobility impairments, explains, Amy Mullins has the classic Marilyn Monroe pose. Here I am, sexual, desirable woman. I quite like it because she's doing exactly what non-disabled models do, but that means I don't actually see myself reflected in it. In my analysis of this story, of this advertisement, I also consider Amy Mullins' perspective. Although her modelling career is a huge success story, she suggests that her work actually receives a lot of criticism because, in her words, to those who observe me, I am both disabled and not disabled enough to neatly fit into an expected disability category. She problematises expectations that because she is disabled, she needs to flaunt her struggles before her achievements can be celebrated. As she says, maybe I'm just not disabled enough for them. Maybe they need me to flaunt my struggles a bit more, to talk about how hard it is for me, to give them a full plate of tragedy before they can accept and award me my triumph. In my opinion, what's always been missing in the broad narrative about disability is some glamour, some fun, frivolity, a bit of benevolent mischief, and honest-to-goodness glamour. Mullins' frustration with expectations from other people recognises how promoting counter-narratives is not simple or straightforward for people who are part of marginalised identity groups. She argues that notions of glamour, fun and frivolity are too far removed from the gloom and doom meta-narrative of disability for many people to accept. However, I would argue that while hyper-glamorous portrayals of disabled models like Mullins give the impression that the fashion industry has been transformed, the underlying message is that disability is only acceptable when it's barely noticeable. Now, you might be relieved to know that I'm on to my final main body chapter. The final chapter, The Cost of Fame, Disabled Supercrips, Superstars and Social Media Influencers, considers cutting-edge developments surrounding disability and advertising, considering how disabled athletes, celebrities and social media influencers are rising stars in the world of advertising. Whereas advertising historically approached disability as a separate entity to the rest of society, advertisements often now encourage audiences to respect disabled people's achievements and star qualities. However, as Cleary highlights, advertisements that promote glamorised depictions of disability can divert attention from the ableist oppression that famous disabled people are, in many ways, protected from. Rather than basking in the glow of celebrities and influencers, many disabled people fear that they will be judged if they do not strive to be more like their so-called role models. Social media influencers with huge online fan bases represent a new generation of celebrity, and brands and advertisers are very keen to capitalise on their relatability appeal. Brands increasingly enlist disabled influencers to feature paid product endorsements in their social media posts. So if you spend as much time on TikTok as I do, you'll notice that Cyprian's laughing at the background because he knows this too well. You'll notice that posts often feature, paid endorsements that appear to be casual, but at the bottom you might see paid endorsement for, days out, for moisturisers, makeup, food and so on. Since influencers' personalities and life stories take centre stage in social media marketing, disabled influencers have opportunities to reflect their affirmative identities with vast audiences. However, as Christensen, Strino and Erickson suggest, content created by disabled influencers who work with commercial brands can conflate commodification and disability advocacy. Social media marketing requires disabled influencers to share their life stories and perspectives in ways that are commercially appealing. To illustrate this issue, I analyse a recent promotional video for hearing aids, which was created by well-known disabled influencer Jessica Kellgren-Fozzard. Kelgren Fozzard, whose YouTube channel explores how she brings vintage lesbian fabulousness to a life with disabilities and chronic illnesses, endorses GN Hearing's ReSound One hearing aids in her video, Why Being Disabled Makes Me a Better Parent. Despite the title of the video implying disability gain, the ways in which deafness and chronic illness enhance her relationship with her child are barely mentioned. Cultivating an emotional connection with the audience, the video focuses on Kelgren Fozzard accompanied by her wife Claudia, and both are shown on this screenshot included on my slide. And they reflect on how Jessica developed trust in her parenting abilities following the birth of their first baby, Rupert. The videos focus on her personal experiences of deafness and chronic illness challenge, as Bolt would say, the received wisdom of the normative social order, which is reinforced in advertisements that only pay attention to disabled professionals' so-called expertise on issues relating to disability. However, in the video, Kelgren Fozzard is mainly portrayed as charming and self-deprecating. So, for example, when discussing how her impairments and chronic illnesses impact how she takes care of Rupert, the meta-narrative of disabled women as, in Scott's words, fragile, delicate and helpless is invoked. So as Jessica Kelgren Fozzard says in the video, I have hereditary neuropathy and Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. It means I'm kind of floppy. I'm not particularly strong, I'm not particularly dexterous, and I'm not particularly fast. When I'm feeding Rupert, I don't actually feed him, he feeds himself, and they joke that she's exaggerating. But when he's feeding himself, it's a joint effort. Being paralysed and then regaining movement is something I've been through a lot. Since I've had to, as an adult, regain the ability to walk, learn how to grasp things, I think that means I'm much more sensitive to the difficulties of learning to do these things. Babies are what we would describe as a bit clumsy, and I'm a clumsy adult, so I empathise with him. And Claudia interjects, it does not help that Jessica's always wearing quadruplet petticoats and her massive skirts. Currently, Rupert is slightly under me at the capability level. At some point he will match me, and then he will overtake me. But I think right now we're a little closer than we would be if I wasn't in any way disabled. Describing her impairments and chronic illnesses as part of her everyday life enables Jessica to veer away from a sensationalised supercrypt narratives. So the hearing aids aren't portrayed as something that have saved Jessica's life, nor are they the main attraction. However, her self-deprecating humour, which makes the advertisement particularly engaging to vast audiences, however, I would argue that it reinforces social expectations for disabled people to appease others, as though they should always be eager to relieve any feelings of awkwardness associated with disability. The only explicit recognition of disability gain occurs later on in the video, when sign language is described as a wonderful way of communicating with Rupert. Although self-deprecation encourages audiences to warm to the advertisement, it reinforces expectations for disabled influencers to be happy-go-lucky in order to endorse the products that they are promoting. As social media algorithms favour videos that gain masses of likes, disabled influencers face a lot of pressure to appease audiences as opposed to confronting ableist attitudes. Whereas disability activists create counter-narratives that pack a punch, when disabled influencers partner with brands, counter-narratives tend to be toned down. Finally, I'll offer some thoughts by means of a conclusion. Perhaps for some readers of this book, the question that begs to be answered is how should disability be represented in adverts? Whenever I do a presentation or I talk to people about this topic, that's the question that they always ask. However, I suggest that attempting to provide a neatly packaged answer to this question is a bit futile, not really a great thing to do, because so-called simple answers to complex questions imply that there is a tried and tested formula for representing the disabled in quotes. Neoliberalism's obsession with quick fix solutions to societal issues dominates existing approaches to promoting diversity in the advertising industry. In particular, in the industry, there is a tendency to lump together marginalised identity groups in overarching equality, diversity and inclusion strategies. The growing popularity of these strategies and initiatives in advertising reflects neoliberalism's bias towards performative, superficial activism and inclusion. Instead of being steered by marginalised identity groups, these formulaic approaches encourage performative responses to ingrained societal problems. Of course, I would call on the advertising industry to dig deeper in its approach to promoting inclusion. As well as making concerted efforts to hire more disabled people, the advertising industry should also consult disability activists, paying heed to their critiques of advertising. After all, the book evidences the many problems surrounding advertisements that claim to encourage progressive attitudes towards disability, despite showing little to no awareness of the disabled people's movement or individuals' personal experiences of disability. That's me done. I realise, by the way, that I appeared to start that class. Rather than being any sort of self-absorption, it's just out of habit, I promise. So now we're going to have a response from Catalin Brylla. I should say that this event will end in around 10 minutes and we're going to head over to the pub. So if anyone does have any questions about the book, then please ask me over a pint. That would be great. But Catalin, over to you.
Thank you. So I'm going to respond to your book, and having just heard your conclusion, I should reiterate my positionality as a media research and filmmaker, and this is where my perspective is coming from. So, well, let's just start to say that as most overworked academics, I was planning to quickly skim through the book and prepare a few rushed responses that would somehow appear meaningful. Little did I know that this book cannot be a quick read. Once I opened it, I was glued to it for literally several days, making plenty of notes and even viewing many of the media examples. This book is as comprehensive and rigorous as it can get in its study of advertising history, aesthetics, narratives, social political context and audience reactions. Although written in a mostly cultural disability study context, it is relevant to other disciplines, and it should be read by all filmmakers or practice-led researchers who engage with media content and disability in creative ways. I first want to highlight some very valuable key points the book makes, and then give a few recommendations for further research. So your book highlights the fact that advertisements reflect, reinforce, and challenge social attitudes towards disability. It thus studies risks, but also opportunities of ads to reduce prejudice. The risks that emerge from your book are that ads use short narratives that often target a mainstream audience, which means that there is little time for proper character development and nuanced portrayals. They are also reliant on stereotypes for efficient communication, and of course, difficult it is how to use non-stigmatizing stereotypes whilst avoiding stigmatizing stereotypes of disability. Their thirst for innovation is a risky one too, since, as you point out, the subversion of conventional representations can easily result either activating stigmatizing stereotypes in the first place or generating new stereotypes such as the supercrip trope. Your book, however, also highlights an amazing set of opportunities to reduce stigma. For instance, ads are everywhere. They exist across platforms and media. They can be found on TV, in cinema theaters, on social media, and in public spaces. So they can reach a wide in-group audience, which means that they can be excellent instruments for stigma reduction. They are usually short and easy to comprehend, so not much cognitive work is required. Or, if it is required, it is usually a pleasurable task to decode subtexts and trying to figure out what it is all about. So they create intrigue. They can create intrigue. Their thirst for innovation and constantly coming up with fresh material is not only a risk, but also an opportunity, as it means that there is a huge scope for counter-narratives to reduce stigma. Lastly, ads are by definition impact-driven in terms of influencing people's attitudes and behaviors. So again, there's a big opportunity to improve attitudes towards disability. And as several of your case studies demonstrate, consumerist and activist agendas can coexist in the same ad. Now, coming back to the risks, a key point you are making is the critical interrogation of positive portrayals, which is still an underexplored area in fiction and documentary film studies. In these disciplines, positive and emotive portrayals are often naively equated with stigma reduction. Indeed, positive representations have started to replace negative representations in relation to many marginalized identities, not just disability. But what does positive actually mean? Emotions such as hope, joy, and surprise can be positive, but does this really lead to positive attitudes? Your book makes a crucial distinction between emotions and social attitudes. An ad that provokes positive emotions in in-groups, i.e. non-disabled viewers, may still perpetuate negative attitudes such as pity or contempt. As you indicate, positive and apparently vicarious emotions generated in non-disabled viewers are often projections by non-disabled media makers, rather than emotions from the perspective of disabled screen characters. This is what Suzanne Keane refers to as false empathy. So when the tragedy model in advertising is replaced with the affirmation model, that affirmation needs to be from the perspective of a disabled person. As Edward Schiappa, one of the co-founders of the parasocial contact model, argues, we need to move away from making dogmatic assumptions of what constitutes a good or a bad representation that can reduce stigma. This is why your analysis of ambivalent and polysemic audience responses, in particular ads, was highly refreshing to read. As you illustrate with Kenneth Cole's We All Walk in Different Shoes, there is heterogeneity in disability communities' receptions of media content. Some may find an ad stigmatizing, others may not, and others may even find it to be counter-narrative. Ambivalence and polysemy provide scope for nuance, and they also illustrate that media content can indeed include traces of stigmatizing stereotypes alongside counter-narratives and non-stigmatizing stereotypes. Indeed, such an approach to media making would resonate well with the social psychology model of bookkeeping, through which stigmatizing stereotypes can only be sustainably reduced bit by bit, progressively, through constant fine-tuning, rather than a radical shift that would alienate in-group audiences. So now let's have a look at some recommendations. Very humble recommendations, because the book is brilliant. So the book is an excellent foundation that maps the current fields in the industry and in cultural disability studies, and that produces new knowledge relevant to a variety of disciplines. So it should be widely disseminated in academic disciplines beyond cultural disability studies, so it can forge complementary collaborations across disciplines. For example, social science disciplines such as social psychology and communication studies or sociology could highly benefit from the book's ideas in order to challenge the still existing naive realism or universalism of many empirical studies about marginalized social groups. At the same time, a lot of the discourse analysis in your book could be corroborated through empirical audience research studies. This relates to how we can study the impact of media on audiences comprehensively. This impact needs to consider the social implications of the media text on a hypothesized spectator as well as on real-life viewers. Such research needs to not only study disabled viewers, but essentially non-disabled viewers and measure their implicit and explicit biases. And of course, as your book suggests, it needs to consider viewing contexts and the intersectionality of particular audience segments in relation to age, gender, ethnicity, and other identities. Another recommendation is your book does briefly touch on internalizing stereotypes or stereotype threats, and you make the crucial observation that, for example, some disabled social media influencers use the superscript stereotype themselves. At the same time, one of your conclusions is that the way forward is to have more media content produced by or in collaboration with disabled people. Future research could be more conscious of the issue of auto-stereotyping. Activist counter-narratives can lead to two risky outcomes in auto-representations. One, the exposition of negative stigmatizing stereotypes like the victim trope, and by doing that, it activates the stereotypes in the first place. Or two, overly affirmative portrayals that do touch on the superscript stereotype trope. Of course, these are only two scenarios amongst many others, more nuanced portrayals, but they are a real possibility and should be taken into account when studying media content produced by disabled creators. For me, however, the most important value of your book is its potential to trigger social change, rather than being only used in academic circles to study media. So, how can the insights of your book inform industry-focused and impact-focused interventions? After all, whilst the advertising industry is an apparatus that has created and maintains a structural ableist hegemony, it is still a growing industry that will not change from big brand advertising to grassroots community advertising, at least not in the mainstream. As several of your examples show, this apparatus can change from the inside as well as through outside forces. How can disability advocacy campaigners pragmatically and sustainably collaborate with advertising agencies and production companies to improve representations? A good example is the British Film Institute's Disability Screen Advisory Group, which consists of disabled filmmakers and activists. How can your research inform an intervention that uses appreciative inquiry to build on existing traditions and resources in the advertising industry with the aim of moving from inclusionist to inclusive representations? How can media makers, whether disabled or non-disabled, learn from your book how to consciously use audiovisual and narrative techniques that reduce the social distance between disabled screen characters and non-disabled viewers? In simple terms, how can your academically groundbreaking book be adapted to a pragmatic industry-focused context where it becomes a pivotal resource for media makers, media activists, and media students to initiate social change? In any case, I can say that for myself, your book was a pleasure to read. I found it incredibly insightful and highly inspirational, not just for my practice-led research, but also on a personal level, and as a non-disabled person, it has prompted me to reflect on my own implicit biases and gain a different perspective. So thank you so much for this very humbling experience.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, so everybody, that brings an end to the event. I really hope that you enjoyed it, and if it's your first time at a CCDS event, I really hope that you attend more in the future. As I've mentioned, we will be heading now to, I've mentioned the book quite a few times, but just so everyone knows that you're very welcome. So it's the halfway house, right?